Thank you all very much for being here today. Welcome. This is Beaver Institute's Beavers Uncovered, a webinar series on underexplored beaver topics curated by Dr. Bonnie Glass-Roglowski and the Beaver Institute. A little bit about the Beaver Institute, if you're unfamiliar or if you are already familiar, I'll make this brief. Beaver Institute is a national nonprofit providing the tools and skills for climate-resilient communities to coexist alongside beavers and the bountiful ecological and economic services they provide. We are essentially here to steward the embrace of beavers across the landscape through our programs and resources. This webinar series, along with our Beaver Corps wetland professional training, are an integral part of our strategy to educate the general public and expand beaver consciousness and beaver-human coexistence across North America. This webinar series in particular looks to weave disparate experiences in Beaverland and gather us in a virtual imaginarium of possibility and opportunity. Today, with many attendees from across the country, but we have across the globe, we're going to create in this very moment a constellatory web through these presentations and discussions, making the local global and the granular magnified. Our presenters will expound upon place-based experiences and research in Seattle, Washington, Charlotte, North Carolina, and the Bronx, New York City, because today, here for the next 75 minutes, it's not just hot town summer in the city, but it's also potentially cool down beavers in the city. Thank you for enduring that. I really had to lean in. I really want to lean in on our webinar title. So I want to thank Becca White, our extern for the summer from Tufts University, here assisting today with questions and sharing links. So if you have questions, pop them into the question box. And that will be steered over to me when we open the floor for Q&A. And also, as I mentioned, the chat box is open. So introduce yourself, say hi, where you're coming from. And then also, before we get started, just want to say we have a special guest at the end of our webinar today to share an exciting beaver opportunity, a summit happening this September. So stay tuned for a little teaser there. But first, I want to introduce you to our panelists. Katie Lamboy is an environmental educator and science coordinator at the Sarah Lawrence College Center for the Urban River at Beczak. Bronx native, she's passionate about supporting her local community and environment. This passion fueled her previous work with the Bronx Children's Museum and the Bronx River Alliance, where her public outreach and beavers returning to New York City waterways propelled Jose and Justin, the Bronx River Beavers, into the national spotlight. Also, Dr. Sandra Clinton is a research assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Her research focuses on the structure and function of freshwater ecosystems in urban settings, including the effects of beaver dams on the hydrology and biogeochemistry of urban streams. Sandra also serves as the co-chair of the National Beaver Science and Research Working Group. And finally, Dr. Benjamin Dittbrenner is an associate professor and director of the Environmental Science and Policy Master's Program at Northeastern University. His research explores the potential of beaver dam networks, including those in urban systems, to offset climate change-induced hydraulic and temperature shifts. He is also the co-founder and associate director of Beavers Northwest, a nonprofit that promotes beaver-human coexistence in Western Washington and beyond. So without further ado, we are going to get this started, and I am going to hand this over to Katie. Katie, take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, everybody can see that? Perfect. My name is Katie Lamboy, and I'm the science coordinator and environmental educator for the Sarah Lawrence College Center for the Urban River at Beczak in Yonkers. I want to take a moment to thank the Beaver Institute for the invitation to speak with you all today on teaching about beaver in the Bronx. To start on this reflection of my career and its connection to beaver, I need to tell you a little bit about my home place. The Bronx is one of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City. It is the only one attached to the continental USA. We are home to the New York Yankees baseball team, although depending on how the season is going, will impact how persons might react to this statement. Right smack in the middle of the borough, there is the historic and famous Bronx Zoo and New York Botanic Gardens. Sedgwick Avenue is recognized as the birthplace of hip-hop music. We are home to, in my opinion, the best little Italy there is, right off of Fordham Road. The Bronx is also home to the poorest congressional district in the United States, with over 270,000 persons living below poverty. Relative to New York State, the Bronx has a crime rate higher than 95% of the state's cities and towns of all sizes. Statistically, persons whom are not local to the area have a higher chance of seeing a Bronx news story showcasing something in a negative light. Even this beautiful art showcased here by Elizabeth Caldwell leaves out these bits of history and culture that are experienced by Bronxites. Why do I say all this? Generally, beaver are not the first thing that come to mind when people think about the Bronx. The Bronx is also home to the only freshwater river in the city, spanning 23 miles that begins in the county of Westchester at the Kensico Dam and flows past the bustling lives of Bronxites, meeting and becoming an estuary with the Long Island Sound in the Hunts Point Soundview area. This river, like many waterways in New York City, is predominantly inaccessible and has had a long turbulent history with dumping and pollution. The Bronx River was once known as a working river, with 3 dams within the borough alone, which were connected to a grist mill, a snuff mill, and a closed dyeing mill. The industrialization of the river in the 1840s began the steady decline and misuse of the waterway, gaining its ultimate reputation as an open sewer. This photo showcases the river in its darkest of times, the 70s. Now imagine, you were born and raised on a tropical island in the Caribbean. Rivers and streams are a life source for your family. It is a social meeting place, an integral part of your everyday life. You immigrate to the US for a better life for your family. You move to the Bronx. Your new local river looks like this. This is my story. My grandfather moved from the island of Boricua, also commonly known as Puerto Rico, in the early 70s. He worked hard to provide and support others within his family with a home in New York City as well, like many families in the Bronx. Weekends were used to join in community with other immigrants, trying to recreate the social setting of El Campo here in their new home. Rivers call to them. The community cuts open fences and trespass to reach the river. To cool down on a hot summer day, just like today. To throw in a makeshift fishing rod, pulled together with trash materials found at the river. During one of these gatherings, my grandfather's brother dies. He's taken by the river in a drowning accident. What started out as a day reminiscent to those back on the island ends in tragedy. I, raised by my grandparents in the South Bronx, lived my whole life being told to beware of the Bronx River. Many people in my Bronx community have similar stories. We are warned of the dangers of our rivers and to stay away from them. They are dirty, gross, and even dangerous. As an educator, my biggest challenge of teaching about the environment in the city is about changing the negative perception that have long been ingrained by experience into our DNA. The restoration and preservation of the Bronx River begins in the late 70s as community members grow tired of seeing cars and truck tires carelessly dumped on a daily basis. The Bronx River Working Group is a seed that sets off a chain blossom of different nonprofit groups that carry environmentalism and environmental education as part of their mission. YMPJ youth walk through the streets of the South Bronx carrying canoes from their offices to the river. The Point CDC uses art to highlight entrances and access points to the river. Rocking the Boat teaches teenagers how to build wooden boats from raw materials and use said boats to conduct environmental research on the water. The Bronx River Alliance becomes a coordinated voice of the river and provides free community paddling as an educational tool. There are many opportunities to learn about the river and engage with it safely, now that many resources, protections, and efforts have been invested in it. This restoration gives way to the return of nature to the river and the surrounding ecosystem, and specifically, it welcomes Jose the Beaver. The presence of Jose, named after Senator Jose Serrano, who was a large supporter of the Bronx River restoration work, became a celebration story for the Bronx. His presence was the shining star of what can happen when communities work together for a common goal. And most importantly, what can happen when education is the foundation of said work. The story of education around beavers in the Bronx started with the education of the river itself. In order to continue building trust of the safety of the environment and creating an informed community member, It was important to incorporate culture and recreation into the learning experience. Understanding that most people within our community, me included, had never seen a beaver in the wild, nor captivity before, was an important jumping block in creating an understanding of the importance of these beavers' presence in our neighborhood. Most public schools in the Bronx have little to no budget for field trips out to environmental organizations, or are faced with administrations that hold caution and safety to the point where students are unable to explore the outside confines of their school walls. These are all considerations that are critical in the planning of education programs. Bringing nature into the classroom became a very common practice for our programs. The Bronx Children's Museum created a Bronx River exhibit on an old school bus that was gutted on the inside and made to look like you were out and one with nature. This multi-sensory exhibit introduced the nature of the river and its neighborhood-friendly beaver in a safe, controlled, and exploratory environment. Students were welcome to explore the bus and find many stuffed species of birds, plastic butterflies and insects, turtle shells, and finally in the corner, a taxidermy beaver cozy in his den. Finalizing the presentation of sensory exploration, an exhibit guide would sprinkle clean litter around the exit space of the bus. Students would then be asked to help us protect our beaver friend by cleaning up our river space as they left the bus, hoping this will connect our love for our new friendly-ish looking beaver buddy and empowering students with the understanding that they have the power to make positive change in their community. For me, the river having a beaver really made my job easier. You see, beaver are cute. They have soft fur, a flat tail. The babies are absolutely adorable. Without beaver, I would have to try to sell the story of the Bronx River using things like trees and birds. Both critically important in ecosystems, of course, just much harder to engage with. Even the most suspicious and cautious community members found a chance to touch the beaver pelt nearly irresistible. As students felt the pelt, we were able to have conversations about the importance and roles of the different beaver body parts, We were able to hypothesize about other animals who may have similar body systems to keep them waterproof. Students would tell me how their pet at home had similar fur that they loved to pet. The beaver feels familiar and safe, unlike, say, insects. Even adults could not resist the opportunity to pose with one or all of our beaver-related artifacts we had on showcase. These items were an opportunity to learn and inquire the whys, whats, and hows, and to share in storytelling about our own experiences with the river. Ultimately, what was important for me was for community members to be told that the river they see from the 6th train, that they cross over while driving on Pelham Parkway, the one that they canoed on with their families, was theirs. That this beaver was just one cute thing about one of the most magical places in our home borough. That this river can transport us in the good and hard times. That this river is a place of celebration and learning. That our environment is ever changing and we all have to do our part to protect it. To this day, I have yet to meet Jose nor the generations that came after him. I have since moved on to different organizations and educational institutes, but I will always owe my career to the community that opened their hearts and minds and gave touching the beaver pelt a chance. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Katie. That was an incredible presentation. And as a old New Yorker, I lived there for about a dozen years, and it's amazing. As you well know, Katie, and for those of you familiar with New York City, you can live your whole life in that city and not know many of the communities and pieces that make it up. And just having that context and leading us into that was really beautiful and important, Katie. And I'm really grateful for sharing that and that whole story. Just an immediate response, the sensorial experience, that felt experience of having to have not mediated through screens or anything else, it blows people's minds, I think. And it's that sort of touch that I think we need to bring into education. So thank you for your work, and excited to hear more about it when we get open to the questions. But I'm going to move on. We're going to move on to Dr. Sandra Clinton with your presentation.
All right. Thank you, Adam. Let me just share my screen. All right, and let me know if you can't hear me or see anything. So I'd also like to thank the Beaver Institute and the other panelists and all of you for joining us today. I'm going to talk about beavers in Charlotte, North Carolina, and with a broader, within this context of the southeastern US. So as you can witness from this webinar and the interest in it, beavers are really common in urban areas now across the United States. We find them particularly in Charlotte and other parts of the Southeast in our parks, in our stormwater ponds, and our restored urban streams. And as you can see from this the picture on my left of the screen, that in some parts of Charlotte, the beavers have become part of our community, and our stormwater agency has put out interpretive signs to help with public education about why we should care about beavers in our urban environment, their role and the importance of maintaining them in the urban environment. So just to give you an idea about beavers in the Southeast, I just grabbed some screenshots from iNaturalist yesterday, where every red dot is a hit where somebody observed beavers or beaver activity. And I did this both for North Carolina and for Georgia, just to demonstrate it's not just North Carolina with lots of beavers. And then the lower pictures, you can see specifically for urban areas of Charlotte and for Atlanta, the number of beaver observations. And I would like to highlight that just on iNaturalist, there's only 25, 26 beaver observations. There are a lot more beavers in both of these cities. And these beavers are having a lot of impact on the landscape, the hydrology, the water quality that my group is really interested in learning more about through research, but also in terms of how we think about managing beavers on the landscape as well. So what are some of the advantages? So there are advantages and conflicts with having beavers in urban areas. And so the advantages are beaver ponds are natural nature-based solutions. So in urban areas, it's pretty common to build some sort of stormwater infrastructure. In Charlotte, we build a lot of ponds. And the purpose of ponds is to capture stormwater runoff, hold it, so that it decreases flooding downstream, and have natural treatment, so to improve water quality as that water leaves the stormwater pond and goes back to the stream. Well, beavers do this for us and at no cost. And so at least no financial costs that we have to pay them. And so in urban areas, beavers are also building these natural impoundments. And one of the research questions that my group is working on, along with researchers from Georgia State and UNC Chapel Hill, is actually quantifying what are the hydrology and water quality impacts of these urban beaver ponds, and how do they compare to human-made stormwater ponds, so that we can use this information to make better management decisions about how we work with stormwater and alleviate stormwater impacts in urban areas. Another aspect of the nature-based solution that we look at with urban systems is that we're really interested in restoring our urban streams. So you can see from this picture a typical urban stream before and after restoration. There are many goals with urban stream restoration, but two of them is to reconnect our streams to their floodplains. Urban streams are highly channelized before restoration. And then also by doing so, improve our groundwater surface water interactions, which is important for hydrology, water retention, and water quality. And so we do this through projects that are expensive, to be honest, and some projects have really positive results, and some projects maybe not as many. And so again, I argue or would say that beaver ponds do the same thing. By having beaver dams that create ponds and wetlands, we are reconnecting streams to our floodplains and impacting our groundwater surface water interactions. So you can see from these three pictures, this is one of my field sites. This is the lower dam. I'm standing on a bridge looking upstream. There are actually 3 beaver dams as we move upstream. This is just the lower one. And you can see when we started the project, you can actually, I think, hopefully see the dam across the middle of that first picture from fall 21. If you look at where my well is, that's where we're logging water level. And when we started the project, the dam wasn't so big. it was starting to create a little pond upstream of it. Within a year, the beavers had expanded that pond and the whole valley was flooding and creating a wetland. And this summer, as my students informed me when they were out a couple of weeks ago, the dam is so entrenched and across the whole valley now, there's actually no water, very little water trickling downstream from this tributary to its junction with the main stem. And so you have these beaver ponds holding water on the landscape, reconnecting the stream to its valley and to the groundwater. And so again, these beavers are providing these ecosystem services to us that we don't have to do anything for. We don't have to build this. They will build it for us. Another aspect of these nature-based solutions and along with common stream restoration is that we want to increase biodiversity in our urban areas. So urban streams are incredibly degraded. Their biodiversity is low compared to forested systems. But you can see if you compare this urban stream that's not restored to the lower picture of a beaver pond, the beaver ponds are adding extra habitat complexity and then additional biodiversity to our watersheds. And so some research that my master's student, Lauren Anderson, did in my lab is she looked at beaver ponds. So the 4 left bars are beaver pond sites, beaver ponds and wetlands. The 5th bar is a restored stream, Reedy Creek, and the next bar is an unrestored creek, Toby Creek. And basically each color on these bars is a different invertebrate taxa. And so what you can really jumps out at you is that the beaver sites have different taxa in abundance than our restored stream and our unrestored system. And so because beaver ponds and wetlands have slower water and different habitat in terms of vegetation, they're going to, that habitat structure is going to relate to having different sets of invertebrates. I will also say that just based on our visual observations that these beaver ponds and wetlands, in addition to invertebrates, are attracting obviously birds and amphibians, but they're also attracting, we've seen muskrat there, and they're also really common habitats that connect waterways for river otters in Charlotte. And so if you look at the whole community of invertebrates living in these beaver ponds, how you look at this graph, all you need to know is that the sites that are closest together are most similar. So I put a circle around the beaver sites. So what that shows is that the invertebrates that are living in the beaver ponds and wetlands, those communities are more like each other than they are like stream communities. It doesn't mean that stream communities aren't important or that beaver pond communities are more important. I really think what we need to do in the urban systems is think about a watershed approach. And so within a watershed, these beaver ponds are adding this additional diversity to the system. Now, all of those advantages of nature-based solutions that beavers provide, of course, come with a conflict side. And so for everything that I just talked about, there's a challenge in urban areas. So we love to have these big, expansive beaver ponds. However, many homeowners are very concerned about flooding. And it doesn't necessarily mean their home is being flooded, but just seeing water on the landscape can cause anxiety for some people. We're also concerned about that impact of the ponds on infrastructure. We talk a lot about bridges and culverts, but I would have you also think about what is the infrastructure next to our streams in urban areas. So in this picture where I've placed the circle, this is actually that same site I showed you earlier for the beaver pond. This is the most upstream pond. And when the water is high, it floods out the sewer line. So there's a sewer line running next to the stream, and it's pretty much underwater with this beaver pond there. And that could have an impact on how that sewer line is being managed. Also, we have electrical lines, power lines next to our streams. As these pond environments expand, it impacts how people can get to those lines to maintain them, or if there's a maintenance issue that they have to get to quickly, dealing with flooded areas with electricity could be a little dicey. one of the biggest concerns that I hear about when people learn that I work on beavers in urban environments is this concern about sediment. So in the Southeast, a lot of our restoration work is based around decreasing erosion and decreasing sediment. Sediment is a pollutant. It's one of the main pollutants in Charlotte that impacts biodiversity. And so beaver ponds are great. They retain sediment. But there's always the question about what happens if the dam breaks. And so there isn't a lot of research in urban areas about how long dams last, their age, how much sediment they're storing, what happens if they break, the impact of that sediment flowing downstream in an urban environment. And so this is really a place where we need more information. And these pictures are actually the same site. In fact, they're taken about a year apart. So this is one dam that broke. Although if you go back out there again, the beavers have been back out there and rebuilt it again. And so another big conflict, especially that I don't know, at least in the Southeast is an issue, is beavers really love stream restoration projects. And so on the right, you can see a newly constructed urban stream restoration project. And then a year later, on the left, this is a different site, but it provides some context, is another year-old restoration site that the beavers moved into. And so this is of concern because of the way we fund our restoration through the mitigation process. And so our restoration projects need to be monitored and they have to meet specific goals. And if they don't meet those goals, then they're considered a failure and there's repercussions. And so the issue is that it's no longer a stream. And so there is absolutely no way a beaver pond will meet the same geomorphology, flow, sediment goals that a stream would. And so this is really a place where there has to be more dialogue and some flexibility that we can allow beavers to move into our restoration projects and not consider it a failure. So just to summarize, within Charlotte, North Carolina and other cities here in the Southeast, beavers are amazing. They're creating these new ponds and wetlands, which especially at the watershed scale is really important for improving water quality, retaining sediment, increasing in biodiversity. All of these are important ecosystem services. All of these services also come with this challenge of how we manage beavers in the urban environment. And I would say across the US, we need more data, but especially in the Southeast, we don't know a lot about beavers in general. In more recent times, there's some older papers and data available, and we really don't know a lot about beavers in the urban environment. And we need that information to better manage beaver-human interaction so that we can retain beavers in the urban area. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. That was great. I'm often finding through these presentations that, if we don't go into this with nuance and recognize that there's challenges, right? There's challenges to all of these efforts, but just having that data and seeing those pictures of where we're successful and over time, how quickly nature restores itself with the help of beaver. So thank you. I'm just gonna keep moving us along, and then we're gonna get to questions. I think after Ben's. So, Dr. Benjamin Dittbrenner, can you hand the mic over to you?
All right, great. Thank you, Adam. Are you guys seeing that? Adam, are you seeing my screen?
I am, yep.
Excellent. All right, my name is Ben Dittbrenner. I'm happy to be here. Thanks to Adam and the Beaver Institute for hosting this, and welcome everyone who's on. I saw a lot of people I know, so welcome friends and people, future friends. So happy to talk about beavers. I'm going to focus on beavers in the Northwest and specifically in the city of Seattle. So I wanted to start off by talking about some of the history of beaver control through time and talk about some of the less commonly discussed aspects of beaver control beyond kind of the big thing, which is what everybody knows, which is large scale fur trapping. So this is a map of the historical beaver range in North America, and beaver are a generalist species. Sometimes we talk about beavers since they are in a relative low point in their population. We talk about them in similar terms in ways that we would talk about other species that are less generalist, that are maybe more threatened because their habitat is being impacted and things like that. But beaver are really a very resilient species, and even though they have specific habitat constraints and needs, they are able to repopulate dramatically quickly if given the chance. And the reason that we're seeing beaver coming back now is because we are seeing less and less trapping pressure and less pressure or more pressure to find non-lethal solutions, which is really great. Historically, prior to European colonization, there was somewhere around 400 million beavers in North America. We don't know exactly, but that's a general estimate. And there was about 26 beaver per kilometer, more or less. However, because beaver are dependent on specific habitat types, that number, they were not evenly distributed throughout the landscape. So beaver are largely dependent on local morphology. While they're ecosystem engineers, they need relatively flat land for damming. The flatter it is, the more impact a single dam could make. So if beavers are on flat ground and they build a 1-foot high dam, they can get a pretty big pond. If they're on a gradient, a 1-foot high dam might not make much of a pond at all, might just be a puddle. So they really prefer lower gradient habitats. They can be found up to maybe even 10% slope, but they really prefer low gradient habitats. They need continuous water flow. If a system is a perennially flowing system and it's maybe on the fringes and it's impacted by climate change or other hydrologic aspects, and it becomes a seasonal stream, beaver will quickly move away from them. So they need perennially flowing water, and then of course food. They need woody vegetation or herbaceous vegetation that's available throughout the year. The good news for beaver is that the North American continent has just a plethora of aquatic habitats. About 80% or 85% of streams in North America are headwater streams. That's the preferred stream type for beavers. So most stream systems are ideal for beaver habitat. And prior to land conversion, it's estimated that there has been about 1 billion ponds and wetlands in North America. So just a vast array of potential habitat for beaver to occupy, make their own, and then expand and make even better. However, these streams and wetlands are also interesting for people as well. The same habitat that beavers like often is places that humans prefer. So humans target low gradient environments with water sources for a variety of applications. As people moved into these areas, some of the first uses that they targeted were things like agriculture and industry, using streams as mills, things like that. And as we've moved more into the current times, we additionally rely on some of these areas for urban expansion and linear infrastructure and other land use types. So as we've been doing this, we've been converting many of these old beaver complexes that have been trapped. Beaver's been trapped out, the beaver complexes have been drained, then we've been converting into these other land use types. In 2019, I created a beaver habitat suitability model called a beaver intrinsic potential model, or a BIP model. I did it for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, covering the entire state of Washington. And the idea was they were interested in finding some sort of tool to help them regulate beaver relocation. So in Washington state, beaver relocation has really taken off. That's regulated by the state, by DFW. They needed, as part of their toolbox, a tool that showed where beaver could be placed on the landscape. So I created a BIP early on in some of my research, and I recreated this BIP model for the entire state to help them with it. The model looks at, morphology relative to the flatness of the area, the perennial flow, other potential food types, but it does not consider things like land use type. So it's applied throughout the whole state, regardless of whether it's an urban area or not an urban area. And not surprisingly, when we looked within urban areas, beaver habitat quality within those areas is consistently high there. So as to be expected, but still pretty interesting. So what we're looking at here is a aerial overlay on Google Earth with the bit model overlaid over the top. So red streams are high quality habitat, orange streams are moderately high quality habitat, yellow streams are medium to low quality habitat, and then blue streams are areas that don't support beaver occupation. It's interesting to see that within the city of Monroe, which is where Monroe, Washington, which is what we're looking at, almost every single stream that we see is high quality habitat. And that's also borne out because the city of Monroe is actively managing beaver in many of its streams in those systems. And then if you look beyond the city of Monroe, up towards the top of the image, you can see farmlands. And then once again, all of those areas, lowland areas, are just all high quality habitat, and there's beavers all throughout all of that stuff. When we start to look at other urban systems and look at suitability models in those systems, it's the same story. Beaver in or streams in cities are really high quality beaver habitat for the most part. Now, the general rule of ecology is if there's available habitat, a species will often expand to fill it. So why are we starting to talk about urban beavers only now? Why are they not already in these systems? Have they not been always in these systems? Well, it comes down to the fact that there's been a long history of intensive beaver control up until recently. With westward expansion, Europeans began to inhabit many of these areas that were once beaver habitat. And along with this establishment of people came a systematic control program. So we're all aware of the intensive fur trapping that happened essentially through about the 1600s to the start of the 1900s. And through that time, the beaver population was largely decimated. It went from about 400 million down to an estimated 9 million beavers. So that's about 1.8% of the total beaver population from the historical population levels. What often doesn't really get talked about is what happened after that. So following this large-scale fur trapping effort, people began moving westward. People began occupying some of these areas. People began building homesteads, building farms, building urban areas, industry. And as they did so, beavers began to come back. So there is kind of a common misnomer that I've heard many times that almost all beavers were trapped out of the contiguous United States, and we had to bring beaver back down into the US from Canada to start replenishing the population. That's not exactly true. Beaver populations really, or the trapping of beavers began to slow down once it was no longer economically profitable to continue trapping because the population was so low. That doesn't mean they were completely gone. They were gone in some areas, but they were pockets of beaver here and there. So as beaver trapping started to slow down in many areas, those populations started to rebound. And beaver are a prolific species. They're rodents. They don't reproduce like hamsters and rats, but they do a pretty darn good job of reproducing and then sending out young into the landscape and recolonizing. And that's really what they're really good at. So they often do that. So as people moved into these landscapes, they saw beaver coming back in there. And as they saw those beaver coming back, they were starting to try to occupy those same areas that they had originally been in that now people were really interested in utilizing for their own purposes. So we began to establish state and federal and local programs that would essentially control beaver and keep them at very low populations. And we did that for about 100 years. And so a number of local and state federal agencies were part of this population control program. So we had the Army Corps of Engineers. Army Corps of Engineers is responsible for maintaining waterways and navigability. They were often going into areas and trapping out beaver in those areas. We also had agencies that were associated with agriculture controlling beaver in ag-dominated landscapes. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Canadian Department of Agriculture, state and provincial agencies were all responsible for systematically, literally walking through streams and finding beaver dams and popping those beaver dams and also putting traps in those systems and removing beaver dams as they occurred. When those populations were relatively low, once you trapped out a colony, the recurrence rate was pretty low. You could expect beaver to come back maybe 10 years later, but they weren't immediately coming back for the most part. We also had in areas where there was human population, pretty ubiquitous nuisance control. The standard at those times was if there was a beaver in the area, they would be trapped out. APHIS is part of the USDA. It's an agency that does wildlife control, and they still do. And they've taken out quite a good number of beaver, especially in areas where they're assumed to be causing problems. But that's also true with many other state and local agencies. And then there has been a assumption in many cases that beaver dams create fish passage barriers. So there's been many state agencies so both Washington and other places that have gone through and broken out beaver dams to allow fish passage to occur. So together, all of these efforts until relatively recently have combined to create pretty low populations and keep those populations in check. And like I mentioned, the recurrence continued to be relatively low until recently. One thing I should mention, though, the purpose of all of this is not to demonize the agencies that were doing this. That was kind of the management approach at the time. Interestingly enough, many of these agencies now are actively promoting beaver expansion, habitat creation, and just overall habitat benefits throughout the areas that they're controlling. So we've seen a pretty dramatic shift in some of the policies of these agencies. Okay, so why are we starting to see some of the beaver populations in areas coming back? Well, for one, some of those policies, like I mentioned, have changed. We're starting to see some of the benefits that beavers create, and that those benefits are substantial enough to change federal, state, local policy and some of the ways that people are managing those systems. There's also been a shift in the way that the public is perceiving beavers and the impacts that they have on the environment. So this is an example of a change that happened in Washington State. So prior to the year 2000, there was the ability for anyone to trap a beaver if they were causing a conflict. And so the standard way was to use the conibear trap. So it's pictured here. It's basically like the cartoon bear trap. If you open it up and something triggers it, it snaps shut and grabs the beaver. Oftentimes what people would do is take that trap and put it in the opening of the beaver lodge, or put it on a slide where beaver come out of the water, or put it on the dam. The beaver would come past, they would grab them, and then if they were underwater, they would drown, and if they were on land, the trappers would come and grab them and then euthanize them at that point. People around 2000 started to get to the point where they felt like there was enough of a groundswell to work on laws to outlaw this trapping approach. And in the year 2000, there was a referendum that banned body gripping traps for beaver at least. So prior to 2000, kind of the standard, this graph is showing the yearly beaver harvest. This is probably not accurate completely. There's probably a twice or 3 times or 4 times more beaver being taken and not reported, but the reported numbers were somewhere around 5,500 beaver on average prior to the year 2000. Once the rule changed, the new rule required that trappers use these live traps. These are suitcase traps, and basically how they work is you open them up like a suitcase. Half of the suitcase goes into the water, half goes out of the water. There's a lure, which is a scent lure placed on the trap. The beaver come in at night because they're really curious. They're really interested in smell. They have a great sense of smell. They swim in, they touch the trigger, the trap catches them, and then the trapper has to come back and then collect the beaver and euthanize the beaver at that point. The interesting thing is that these traps weigh about 45 pounds, so you can probably only realistically carry 2 at once. You have to check them every day per the law. and they're much more expensive than the conibear traps. So this change in trapping technique essentially made it much, much harder and much, much more costly in terms of time and gear and everything else for trappers to conduct their business. As a result, a lot of the trappers who were on the edge of kind of the trapping, maybe the old timer trappers who were just doing it out of tradition or because they liked it, all of those people basically stopped trapping. And we saw a dramatic decline in the amount of trapping that was happening. And as a result, after that year, 1999, we saw a decline of almost 90% in the numbers of beaver that were reported to be trapped. So we went from about 5,500 to about 500 or maybe 1,000. So a dramatic decline in overall trapping. And we've seen similar laws like this taking place in other states and other jurisdictions. So there's just an overall change in the perception of how we should be managing the species, and that is directly affecting the overall population. So in 2019, as a result of these increases in the population, we were really interested to take a look at what was happening in urban environments. So I, and along with a couple colleagues, did a survey throughout the city of Seattle and looked at if we could find beaver within the city. There had been many instances or reported instances of beaver in the city. So we did a comprehensive survey. We walked every stream in the city that was daylighted anyways, and found to our surprise that of course, there was the beaver in places that people had been pointing to and reporting to us, but there were many beaver populations in areas that people didn't even know about. And it turned out that there were basically either historical evidence or active evidence of beaver in every single stream that we surveyed, which is every stream, and also many populations within the Lake Washington shoreline, which is the area on the right of this map, and then within the Ship Canal and within Lake Union, which is in the center here. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but this area right here. So beaver had not only come back, but they came back in force, and they were occupying almost every bit of habitat that they could possibly occupy. So we were really surprised to find this level of activity within the city. Okay, so what does this occupation look like? Well, early on, what we were originally seeing was a lot of beaver damming happening in more of the suburban areas surrounding Seattle. This is a pretty typical picture of a stream system that beaver have come into and really plugged up an area that was maybe a tightening of the stream system or some other constriction, and just dramatically increased the stream system or the pond within those areas. But pretty quickly after that, we started to see signs of beaver in the city everywhere. So this is one of the freeways going through Seattle north to south, and there's a giant beaver dam right next to the freeway. There's another one on the other side. There's ones to the left outside of the picture and to the right, so they're all over the place. And then pretty soon population levels got to the point where we were seeing not only evidence of beaver, but we were seeing beavers themselves floating around. So this is the Ship Canal that I mentioned. This is a really heavily used waterway that connects the Puget Sound to Lake Washington. Heavy ship traffic, heavy recreational vessel traffic, and people actively are seeing beaver floating around and doing beaver business within this really, really urban waterway. There's even evidence in instances of seeing beaver within local neighborhoods, coming totally out of the water, coming totally out of the riparian area, and exploring areas that you would never ever expect to see a beaver in. So pretty awesome. And my absolute favorite story is, so Seattle is kind of known for having within their central little lake, it's called Lake Union, a whole bunch of houseboats. And one of the houseboats has a beaver colony that has built a lodge underneath it. And apparently they're not causing problems because they continue to live there, and people see them swimming around and going into their lodge, coming back out. So they're really utilizing the urban landscape to the greatest extent possible, sometimes even more than what we could even possibly imagine. Okay, so of course there's going to be challenges and benefits that result from all of this beaver occupation. So some of the challenges are the same old story, things like flooding from damming, things like plugging of culverts, things like cutting down urban trees. This stuff has been happening forever, so not really surprising, but there are some other issues that are kind of specific to urban areas that are interesting, and this is one example here. So this is a urban area just north of downtown Seattle, and this area has a big wetland complex in the area in the middle of a housing development that is surrounding that wetland system. And this was built at a time when there was virtually no buffer requirement, so the houses are right up against the stream. So their backyard is basically some backyard, maybe some trees, and then wetland right there. Beaver moved in a few years ago, and they built a massive dam, a super impressive dam. And then from the story that I heard, people or one person started messing with this dam. They were afraid that the dam was a potential hazard because it was impounding so much water. Ironically, because this person was messing with the dam, they destabilized it and the whole dam blew out. And all of that water that was being impounded started rushing into the neighborhood. Now, because this is an urban area, and because at the time that this area was developed, there was no local environmental regulations requiring buffer sizes or anything like that. There was nothing to attenuate the flow. There was nothing to soak up the water. There was nothing to redirect the water. The stream that carries water out of the wetland is relatively small. So all of that flood water went into the neighborhood. Their storm systems were totally insufficient to deal with this level of water, and the whole neighborhood basically was underwater for about 2 days. So a pretty dramatic impact. And this is the kind of stuff that we might see in areas, in urban areas where there's low topography. You know, if we have a lot of water coming into this area, it has to go somewhere. And if there's low topography, it's going to flood it out until it flows away. So this is definitely one of the types of constraints and challenges that we have in urban systems. However, we have a lot of benefits. Sandra talked about some of these, and so I'm not going to go into huge detail here. But in many of these areas, Beaver have begun to transform the natural areas. They build dams, they create ponds and wetlands, or they expand some of the ponds and wetlands that they've had. In Seattle, at least, people have been overwhelmingly supportive of Beaver moving into these systems and building dams. There's of course people who are concerned, sometimes uncertain, but most people are pretty supportive of the Beaver being there. Additionally, and maybe more importantly, the city of Seattle has been really supportive of having Beaver moving into these systems. And specifically, the Seattle City Parks has taken a stance of tolerance. So there's been tree depredation in these natural areas. There's been some flooding, but they've taken this wait and see approach. And what they found is that the impacts that they perceived as potentially problematic kind of sorted themselves out over time and didn't turn into the problems that they thought they might have turned into. We're seeing many ecosystem benefits in services. So Sandra mentioned these, so I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but flood attenuation and sediment capture, water quality improvements, all these things, really great stuff. And then biggest of all, just I've been a huge advocate of ecosystem engineers and urban green spaces because they have the ability to take the quality of habitat and bump it up one level from what humans are traditionally able to do in those areas. So beavers are moving into these areas and just increasing habitat quality, levels of biodiversity, overall complexity in these systems, and maybe most importantly, the climate adaptation. They're really going into these systems and making them more climate savvy, more climate resilient. And that's something that we can hope that will make these systems last longer and more healthy than we would otherwise. And last but not least, Seattle has gotten to the point where we now have sufficient levels of beaver to justify a Canadian hockey bar. So we now have the Angry Beaver. It's an awesome Canadian hockey bar. They have great poutine. So if you are in the Northwest, you got to go check it out. It's awesome. It's super fun. Okay, couple conclusions. Urban beavers are definitely a mixed bag. They have the conflicts that we expect, but there are some of those urban issues that are specific to beavers and urban systems. But the enhancements that they provide in those systems, I think are well worth it, especially in areas that can accommodate beavers. Some urban systems are better suited to beaver colonization. So Seattle is a city that has a lot of topography. So when beavers move into some of these systems, they create dams, they flood out some of the buffer areas, but they don't touch many houses. In other areas that have low topography, or other cities that have low topography, they might not be able to accommodate beavers in the same way. So topography is a huge determinant in some cases on whether beaver can be in those systems. Local policy and public sentiment are hugely important to the success of beaver. If people perceive beaver as problematic, they'll have no chance of getting a foothold. So having a vocal community that's advocating for beaver in these areas is really critical. And then last but not least, beaver are coming whether we like it or not. So finding ways to accommodate beaver, live with beaver, finding ways to have non-lethal controls, which are totally doable, will allow us to transition without some of the growing pains that we've seen in some communities that have been just actively fighting beavers. Last but not least, I have to just make one shameless plug. So I want to just promote Beavers Northwest, and please check out beaversnw.org, the website for Beavers Northwest, for more information about our organization. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening in, and I'm happy to take questions either now or when we do next.
Great. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
So first, I want to open it up and just thank you all again for being here, presenting such disparate experiences and research. And I want to see if you all had any questions for each other before we open it up to our audience. Well, I have a few here that have popped up. Ben, in response to you, are conifers banned in Washington only now as a means to trap beaver? This person says we're still using conifers for ground sets and drowning sets.
My understanding is that they are completely banned, but I don't know the full rules on that. There are always ways to find exceptions, and I think that there could be possibilities that like pro trappers have exceptions that they work out, like special permits with DFW, but I'm not up to speed on that. But the overall rule for recreational trapping and most regulatory trapping is that they have to be done with non-lethal means.
Right. Katie, we had someone ask about the beaver that was named after the politician.
Yeah.
Did he support that, or was he even aware? Or yeah.
Yeah. So at the time, our executive director at the Bronx River Alliance, Linda Cox, she had a very strong relationship with Jose and his team. And Jose really did support, getting the funds allocated to the restoration of the river. So it was a mutual agreement amongst both parties.
That's awesome. That's great. Sandra, how could or should these beaver conversations be considered in city and county zoning and planning and zoning activities?
I think it would be great if they were. That's not something that's done here in Charlotte, or I think in the Southeast in general. I think Ben can comment for Seattle, where I think they've taken that into account for some of their park planning. I think the comment that the beavers are here, right? They're here to stay. And so we have to learn to incorporate them into the landscape. And there are places in urban environments, because it's always a trade-off, that we can retain them. We can have them on the landscape and providing those services. And I think we need to be planning for that.
Nice, thank you. This is to you all. Do any of you work with Indigenous communities in your region? And if so, what has been the extent and outcome of interacting with Indigenous people in your region, especially regarding beaver-centered projects?
So I'll take the short answer, where I do work with, or have done some work with the Catawba Nation, which is the Indian Nation closest to Charlotte, but not on beaver-related work, on stream-related work. And so broadly across the state, I haven't.
This is a great question, though. And this is something that Beaver Institute is actively working in, bringing that knowledge and experiences from communities into our work more often, and more often as we possibly can.
So Adam, sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to mention, so in the Northwest, there's a really active involvement of multiple tribal organizations in beaver management. So on the west side of the Cascades, I've worked really closely with the Tulalip tribes. They've been instrumental in beaver relocation. They've done a lot of workshops in beaver training. They were responsible for expanding what we call the Beaver Bill from limited relocation to statewide relocation. They utilized some of their political clout to make that happen, which, like, amazingly was an overwhelming success through the state legislature. It passed with 100% support, which is, like, I don't even know when that ever happens, especially in this type of political environment. So, like, that was awesome. But there's many other tribal organizations in the Northwest that have really gotten behind beavers because they're really important to some of their historic, tribal values, but they also see the benefit that they provide. And like Sandra was talking about in her presentation, utilizing beavers for restoration purposes takes some of the cost out of that, and it increases some of the insurance. So we put beavers in these systems, they take hold, and if the system becomes degraded because of a big storm event or other types of things, beaver are right back there rebuilding it. Whereas if it was up to us to find another grant source to do that re-restoration, it would just never happen. We just have other priorities. So beavers are coming into these areas, and I think tribal entities are really seeing that, and oftentimes taking the lead in helping utilize beavers to see benefits and just have them on the landscape.
Thank you, Ben. Katie, I'm curious, we had someone asking this question. Can you tell us about your most inspiring or enlightening experience doing beaver education?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I've learned is to try not to stunt excitement. I cannot tell you how many times I have had a student or a community member inform me that they have seen a beaver and then go on to describe a muskrat. I have learned the importance of just encouraging them to continue that excitement and to continue to learn about this beaver that they had seen. And generally, people will take that and transform that into learning more. So definitely not stunting that excitement.
That's great. I think that's a tool we all can use, especially when working with children and young people, wanting to make sure that it's always, that imbuing that and making those embers grow more and more. So thank you for that. Sandra, why is a beaver pond no longer a stream? Why isn't it a sign that restoration has been successful, that beavers moved in?
So the issue is, after restoration, whoever did the restoration, whether it's the city or the county or a nonprofit, they're required, based on the mitigation process that paid for the restoration, to meet certain goals. And a lot of those goals are around sediment and geomorphology. And so a stream, one of the goals of stream restoration will be to have stable cross sections. So width and depth isn't changing over time. If it's a beaver pond, then you automatically fail. And so I agree with the statement, and I think many of us that work in restoration do also agree that having beavers move into a project is a sign of success, but until it's a rule issue. So this is something that has to be changed in how we actually do restoration and what we're required to show. And I know, at least here in the Southeast, that the Army Corps of Engineers is starting to have that dialogue. They're often responsible for signing off on these permits and the goal setting. And so until we can actually change the rules, it's a really big issue. And I know it's an issue in other places in the country as well.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. Ben, how long did it take to get the cities and communities to sign on to these efforts that you mentioned? As this person comments, culture can be really hard to change.
Yeah, it definitely can be hard to change. One thing that was just so surprising about beavers and some of the beaver education and outreach that we've done is, the gold standard for environmental education is behavior change. We tell people what we're hoping for them to understand, and hope that makes a difference sufficient in their life that they change some of their behaviors for the better. That usually doesn't happen. Or if it does, it happens in some sort of limited way. Really surprisingly, I've had meetings with landowners and some sort of education events where you might have 20 or 30 landowners. And some of them are, anytime you meet with landowners, it's a mixed bag. You've got some who love beavers, some who absolutely hate beavers. And I've found that after you talk about beavers and their benefits and constraints and the way you can manage them non-lethally, a lot of people completely change their perspective. And they're like, oh, now that I know that there's a way to manage beavers non-lethally, I think we should totally do it. And I love the fact that we can keep them there. So beavers are one of these focal species that have the ability to change people's perspectives and actually change behavior in the process, which is just amazing. So more specific to your question, I think that when beavers are part of the equation, people want to see them in the landscape. They're cute and cuddly, and they're this charismatic little species, and so they love the idea of having them there. If there's a way to keep them on the landscape and reduce conflict, then that's the silver bullet. Like that's what we should definitely do. So I think that has allowed our city managers to get behind beavers, and then it just took a little bravery for some of those managers to also say, okay, these beavers have cut down some trees. There is a vocal minority of residents who are angry about that, but we're just going to deal with them and just keep telling them, just wait, this area is going to get revegetated with shrubs, it's going to look beautiful, and then it does, and those problems kind of just go away. So it does take a little bit of bravery, but luckily in Seattle, people were up for that challenge.
Awesome. Katie, I'm curious, in what ways could the current urban beaver situation in the Bronx, throughout New York City, be improved to foster even more positive relationships with the city's human communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it definitely sparks curiosity. Most of the Bronx River is bordered by either a parkway or parkland. And so I think that unlike some of the other areas, like we're very excited to have the beaver here. Our river is dammed, and so the ecological impact is really kind of impacting the New York Botanic Garden the most, and they have dealt with that by giving them wood. But I think that their presence has really encouraged people to be curious about the Bronx River and go visit it. A lot of people don't even know it exists. So seeing these news stories that there are beaver in our community really is helping people get to the river.
That's awesome. Thank you. And Sandra, are there any urban specific challenges that you've faced doing beaver research in city or urban environments?
So I would say when we're out in the field, most people we come across are just curious, and they're usually pretty open about hearing about the beavers and having them there on the landscape. I would say that again, it's really mixed. And so I've met homeowners who love having the beavers in their backyard. They think it's the best thing ever. And then I've met other homeowners, like the one site, who basically would call the county because they're like, it's flooding, everything's flooding. It's like, well, it's okay, it's supposed to flood. I would also say one of the bigger challenges is that just how much the landscape is, well, two things. Initially, I think the beavers make the landscape look messy by perception standards. I think people tend to think manicured lawns, forests in a certain, trees in a certain formation, and natural environments are messy. And so I think that is often a criticism as well, that are something that I address when I talk with people, that no, this is what nature actually looks like, and it changes all the time, which I think can also be a little worrisome or cause anxiety for some landowners and homeowners, because it's different every season and every year. So, and I think that just comes back to education and talking about the benefits and demonstrating those benefits. And I like what Ben said about just asking people to be patient and say, just wait. 3 months, you're going to have red-winged blackbirds everywhere on those shrubs, and it's going to be beautiful.
Yeah, the human species, we are an impatient bunch of animals, huh? I want to close with this one, really thinking about the future. What do you think the future of beavers looks like in the Bronx, in Charlotte, in Seattle? So everyone wants to take that baton first and run with it.
I can. I think in order to sustain these populations, specifically on the Bronx River, policymakers have to address the water quality issues and continue protecting the restoration work that was started. Yes, beaver trapping was part of our population decline, but a really big reason that a lot of species did not survive on the Bronx River is because it was so heavily polluted. And restoration work never ends. And so just ensuring that these species can continue to thrive in these systems.
Amazing. Thank you.
I could take a stab. So I'm hoping that Seattle continues to be not only a success story, but an example for other cities. It's really critical that there are examples of success. So other cities who are dealing or starting to deal with these problems have a pathway, like a roadmap that they can look at and say, okay, here are the steps that this city took to get from point A to point B, and we can potentially do the same thing and navigate some of the challenges along the way, but also get to a point where we see beavers on the landscape and we celebrate that they're there. So I really think Seattle is at that point right now, and I'm excited for Seattle to be a city that inspires other cities to follow that same path and see urban expansion in those areas too.
Thank you, Ben.
And I would say for Charlotte that, again, the beavers are here to stay, so we're going to have to learn how to live with them. There are, I think, several people within the local agencies who are very interested in how and where we can retain beavers on the landscape. There's just a lot of unknown questions that we have to answer. But also I find that still within the city, like most people don't know there's beavers here. And so I think there's just still a lot of work to do at the city level and just having education and talking about beavers and their role, both in just naturally their historic role, their current role in cities, as well as other areas.
Awesome. Thank you, Sandra. And thank you, Ben, and thank you, Katie, for being here today and sharing this. It's just, it's got my wheels turning, just having the three of you in here and sharing that. And thank you for all the attendees for coming today. I just want to let you know that we are going to continue with this virtual series, Beavers Uncovered. And with the next month, we'll be hosting Dams Over Troubled Water with Dr. Katie Holzer with the City of Gresham, Oregon, and Denny Murray of University of New Hampshire. They will be guiding us in a discussion on the dynamic effects of beavers on water quality and polluted freshwater systems. And a little teaser into September right now, we're currently planning a panel discussion in September. We're collaborating with the Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Partnership and others for a panel discussion on the Supreme Court's recent ruling on the Clean Water Act, prompting the policymakers within this rigorous discussion on the question, where do we go from here? But right now, I just want to hand the mic over to Hannah Malachy from the Superior Bioconservancy to share with us a very exciting event that's going to be happening in September. So Hannah?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. And thank you to the Beaver Institute for giving us an opportunity to promote our event. I'm Hannah Malachy. I'm the Executive Administrative Assistant for Superior Bioconservancy, which is a nonprofit located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So we're the Midwestern team that's kind of out here with the beaver world. And so like many people today have suggested, is that beaver are a very interesting piece culturally. And in the Midwest, we're feeling like we're pretty far behind on kind of beaver efforts and where we could be in comparison to the East and the West and other areas in the United States. So we have planned, myself and Rachel Segal at the Illinois Beaver Alliance have planned a Midwest Beaver Summit this September. It will be hosted over 2 days on September 13th and then September 20th from 11 to 1:30 p.m. Central Time. So it's about a 2.5 hour each day session where we'll have 3 different speakers each day come and present. We have Dr. Emily Fairfax will be there, Dr. Ben Goldfarb and Lila Phillips will be there giving a book talk about their books. Dr. Wendell's, Dr. Pollock, Mike Callahan will be there, and Lauren Taylor from the Beaver Institute to present on kind of non-lethal methods. And it's completely virtual and online and free to attend. So I will paste a link in the chat right now to it. And you can sign up on Eventbrite just to get a ticket. And everything will be recorded, kind of like here. So it's very exciting. It's the first summit that has been hosted in the Midwest for Beaver issues. We have a lot of co-hosts who are also supporting the efforts, like the Beaver Institute, a couple Land Conservancy and other environmental groups who are interested in hosting it. I will also say excitedly, we already have over 300 people signed up for it. From a wide variety of backgrounds, which is really exciting. So we're hoping that this will create kind of more of a movement here in the Midwest to help educate and support policy changes that will promote beaver on the landscape in similar ways that are being done on the East and the West. Yeah, and also out of it, a little plug, we will have continued speaker series follow-ups kind of like this, but more tailored on the Midwest. So if you're a Midwestern person and you feel like you want to learn more about those specific local issues, that's going to be an option. And we will also be developing a working group for Midwestern specific issues that will meet every other month, just to talk about policy changes that are occurring across the Midwest and how maybe we can support each other from a more local perspective. Nationals are great, and we're taking example from the Beaver Institute to try to make it a little bit more local. So we're going to continue supporting Beaver Institute work while also trying to bring in a little bit more hometown. So yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I can drop my email too in the chat. Yeah.
Thank you, Hannah. And as Hannah noted, the National Beaver Working Groups, which Beaver Institute facilitates, are ongoing. We had a forum last week. It's on our YouTube channel. And feel free to look at that and just know that whatever your skill set, wherever and whoever you are, there's a place for you in the beaver world, and you can contribute to it with whatever skills you have. Just know that we're here and we want to help the world embrace beavers. So what else? I think, follow us. We're on the social medias, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, all over the place. So sign up for our e-blast. And I think that's it. So have a wonderful remainder of your Tuesday. And again, thank you to all the presenters. And we'll see you next month when we do Beavers Uncovered again with dams over troubled water. And thank you to Bonnie and Becca for helping facilitate this and make this all possible. So, all right. See everyone later. Bye-bye.